Good evening, everyone. This is the end, I guess, of week 9. And we've come a long way from the very beginning as we talked about the study of religion. We talked about insiders and outsiders. At this point, I think many of you might consider yourself a little bit more insiders into these early periods. We had some real interesting conversations this week, a lot about the beginnings of Christianity with Eliezer and Adam and Noah, and a bunch of people talking about what those early centuries might have been and what the early relationship was between I suppose, the question of Jewish Christians, Jews who were followers of Jesus, later became Christianity, and so on. And there were some issues that were raised, which were quite interesting and important. A lot of scholarship has been done on that. Let's go back now and reflect a bit on the various issues that we actually talked about in the threads. A bunch of threads, 5 or 6 threads. No, hardly anybody answered. Just a couple of people have responded to the Harkavi question. I'll get to that a little bit later, but I really would like for you to read that essay and think about it, because everybody's always talking about learning from history. How do we learn from history? What kinds of things can we learn from history? Can one learn from history at all? And we have to be very careful with that whole idea. And Harkavi, I think, is very insightful and wise as he helps us try to figure out how that works. So let's go back to the discussion thread questions and see if we can throw any light on them. The first question had to do with the framing of the chapter social and political settings of early Judaism. This wonderful book by Jaffe, which I've used as a textbook over the years, and lots of interesting things there. The concept of early Judaism, which wasn't created by him, but which he has adopted. One of the, so we should focus on both the Judaism word and the early word, right? So what he's really trying to do there, as many of you saw, is say, okay, the texts, the literary materials that got preserved and moved forward were the beginnings of Judaism, early Judaism. They don't necessarily always reflect what they are supposed to have, what's supposed to have happened when they were the period that they're supposed to be talking about, whether it's the period of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, later on the period of the prophets. They really reflect many of the interests of the people in this period called early Judaism. Maybe the period of Ezra and Nehemiah a little bit later, maybe a little bit earlier. It's not so clear. If we think about it that way, then there are some implications with regard to what we are reading about when we read the biblical materials, and I ask you to reflect on that. The Judea and diaspora question, from my perspective, a lot of it has to do with the question of the cultural context in which these early Judeans or Jews were living, and how one understands what is Jewish and what's not Jewish. How does something become Jewish? How does Hellenism get Judaized, as it were, in different places in different ways? How do cultures learn from each other? How are cultures influenced by each other? People today often say, well, that doesn't sound like a Jewish concept, or that doesn't sound Jewish. Let's talk about Jewish values. What are Jewish values as opposed to other values, and where did Jews get these values? Did they come only from Jewish sources? Did they come from the world around it? I would say it's a rather complicated question. And I think the Jewish community has shaped and made their own different values over the years. But I don't know that I would say there is such a thing as Jewish values per se. What Jaffe does talk about are the different challenges in different parts of the world, and the context of whether it's a pure Hellenism, where it's a diaspora Hellenism. The challenges that Jews face in the land of Judea are not the same as the challenges that Jews faced in the diaspora. And therefore, as they assimilate the culture that's around them, Sometimes they respond negatively, sometimes they respond positively, but they are not living without any connection to that culture, whether it's in the diaspora, whether it's in Palestine. They have to engage that culture. And in Palestine or Judea at this time, for many people, the Hellenistic culture was something to be admired, was something that they wanted to be part of, was something they wanted to feel that they could be part of this new world, this modern world, and not simply be looking back to the old times and being archaic and traditional and so on. So as we look at the Maccabean, the Hasmonean rebellion, it's really an interesting question to ask, which side would we have been on if we were living at that time? Would we be on the traditional nationalistic kind of side? Would we be on the side of the Hellenists who want us to be part of this modern world that they're about and to reinterpret and re-understand Judaism and what's called these Jewish values, Jewish issues in the context of the world around us? The third question was about something that Jaffe calls social foundations of early Judaic worlds. He really is talking there a lot about the different Judaisms that occurred at that time. We have this sense that there was something called Rabbinic Judaism, that's all there was, when in fact there were lots of different forms of Judaism competing, and most of the people at that time actually didn't identify with any of these things, whether it was the Yachad, whether it was Rabbinic, whether it was early Christianity, whether it was Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and so on. They were just Jews. They were just people living just as today. There are all these political parties, and most of us in our regular lives are not so passionate about, are we a Democrat, are we a Republican, are we independent? When elections come, then we sort of engage in this. And again, it's not fair. I'm talking about perhaps my own sense of this. But these parties that they talk about in Palestine did not represent, I would say, the majority of the people there. The majority of the people were people who just did whatever they did. And E.P. Sanders, a scholar of the first century, talks about something called common Judaism. What was the sort of the baseline sort of common denominators of Judaism at that time? And Jaffe tries to describe what that might have been with what he talks about the markers of early Judaism. I had asked you to write about a particular movement at that time, and I think many of you have done that task, and some of you picked the Yachad. Nobody picked Rabbinic Judaism, which I guess is the one which comes down to us today, but it's not clear that it was the largest until much later. Neusner, when he talks about varieties of Judaism, essentially he's asking the question, what happened after the destruction of the temple? What are the kinds of things that were responding to this from the varieties of Judaism that were around before the destruction of the temple? And the questions that he asks as well is, what was it about the rabbinic form that we talk about, which was so appealing after the destruction of the temple? And it was around this rabbinic Judaism, what started with the Pharisees, these concepts that we'll continue to be talking about next week and the following week of Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah, the sages, the people who helped to create the kind of continuity from before the temple was destroyed to after the temple was destroyed, so that the rabbis, earlier the Pharisees, had already begun to develop a concept of Judaism which was not totally dependent on the temple. They viewed the temple as central. They viewed the temple as really important, but they were already beginning to deal with the idea that the temple we were going to be able to have a Judaism without the temple. And what did it mean to have a Judaism without the temple? That's the kind of thing that Neusner is talking about, and he points out a number of things that Rabbinic Judaism was able to respond to give a way for the Jews at that time to continue to hold on to their Jewish identity and to have something to move onward with in the future. The beginnings of believers in Jesus and the beginnings of Christianity have started at this time. And according to most scholars, in those early years, there were believers in Jesus who believed that they were still Jews. They still observed the Jewish laws. They did. They came to the synagogue on Saturday. They did all of those things, but they considered themselves believers in Jesus, and that Jesus. The question is what, in fact, they believe. We don't have a whole lot of information on that, but the lines were quite blurred between those groups and other authentic Jewish groups, Jews who continue to, I would say, observe common Judaism, and perhaps the early believers in Jesus, most of them did common Judaism. The big parting of the ways came with Paul when he, and those after him, who said that you didn't have to be Jewish to be Christian. That was a big deal. You didn't have to observe. In fact, you're better off not observing all of these rules. Now, if you were already Jewish, you probably shouldn't stop observing, because those rules, those laws were, if you stop observing, then it takes those rules and makes them really much more important than they were, either starting or stopping. Finally, the Harkavi essay and the story of the rebellion, particularly my interest was in the rebellion of 66 to 70 and 74, in the destruction of the Second Temple. Harkavi, I think, really points to how a minority can control the political events in a community. If they're strong enough, if they're extreme enough, if they're violent enough, if they're passionate enough, then the rest of the people can be swept along with them, which is a little bit scary when you see it there. And when we look at what he talks about in terms of learning from history, he has these 6 or 7 different points that he makes. But one of the most important things that we learn from history is to be wary, to be skeptical, to try to understand that events can overtake you. So we learn from history that extremists, even though they are not necessarily in the majority, they can control a lot of things. But I think all of his comments there are really quite interesting. And the final thing that I asked about Judaic markers, maybe at another time we can talk about it, or maybe during office hours. My time is, I'm already spending more time than I wanted on this video. But I think it's really quite interesting. How would you, if somebody came into the United States who had no idea, let's say was living in far away from anything to do with Western society, and said, well, how would I know if somebody is, if I was a Jew, without asking anything, is there anything universal that Jews do or are or say? How would one go about doing that? I think it's kind of an interesting question. So just a couple of final things. I still haven't heard from all of you with regard to paper topics. Please, please, please be in touch with me about paper topics, about strategies for collecting resources, collecting bibliography, and so on. I'm very eager to help you in putting together this bibliographic essay, but I can't do it if I don't hear from you. And the last thing is the lesson for next week. We are actually going to study Talmud together. And I'm going to give you some materials from Midrash Halacha, from early rabbinic Judaism, that has to do with the actual Talmudic materials, and ask you to study, to find a study partner, either another member of the class or somebody from your community, to sit down and study and read the materials that will be scanned for you on the computer, and then to report back a little bit on your experiences with that. The following week we'll deal with agadic, not legal stuff, but agadic, non-legal materials, more moral, theological, narrative-oriented. So I hope that you all have a Chag Urim Sameach, a happy Hanukkah. Chag Urim is the holiday of light, the holiday of lights. That you have a happy Hanukkah. I also hope that maybe if you did the reading, you can raise some of those issues with people that you're celebrating Hanukkah with, some of the things that we talked about last week in class. And also a happy Thanksgiving, which, as you know, is one of the, another 70,000 years or so we'll be able to celebrate Thanksgiving and Hanukkah together. Take care, everyone.